Welcome to Let's Talk. Our session today is titled, Let's Talk About Expulsion and Suspension and the Role of Quality Improvement. I'm Debbie Mathias from the BUILD Initiative and the Director of the QRIS National Learning Network. Before we begin our session, I'd like to thank the Alliance for Early Success and other generous funders for making this learning community possible. We began this series for state quality administrators and leaders to support their essential work within states around early learning systems building. Quality administrators are welcome to invite other participants as related to the specific topic of the call. We know several of you invited colleagues interested in QRIS implementation and policy, as well as colleagues from Head Start, pre-K, child care subsidy, early intervention, special education, and early childhood mental health consultation. We have colleagues on the call from over 29 states and territories, and I can tell this topic was of interest to many by the numbers of folks that signed up. We intentionally keep the sessions small to invite conversation and sharing. We hope these calls enable us to illuminate challenges, innovation, and promising practices. After the session, a survey will pop up asking for your suggestions, comments, or questions, and we appreciate your input and ideas about the session, and we'll follow up with resources as requested. Also, thinking ahead, tell us if you know you're working on a promising practice or facing a challenge in your state system building. Send me an email and we can develop a Let's Talk discussion around the topic. Make sure to keep track of your ideas, questions, and examples for our talks throughout the session. Enter things in the chat box and we'll be sure to respond and get your point of view out there. Now to this topic. As research has revealed, expulsion and suspension are stressful, negative experiences that can impact child outcomes. We aim to explore the dimensions of early childhood expulsions and suspensions and discuss the role of quality improvement in decreasing and preventing expulsion, supplemented with a specific example from the state of Arkansas. Thank you for taking the time to answer the questions when you registered. Many of you provided thoughtful ideas and questions. We reviewed the information, and it's informing the presentation. During those questions, folks entered ideas and questions such as, what policies do states have in place for expulsion and suspension of young children? How were these policies formed? What other states are doing about enforcement of policies? How is the work being embedded in QRIS to support educators? What work's being done about the disproportionate number of youth of color being suspended? Some of you shared links to policy, legislation, research, and strategies you're using in your state, and we really appreciated all of that information. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Carrie McCann is the Assistant Director of State Services for the BUILD Initiative and has studied and written on the topic of expulsion and suspension. Nikki Edge is an associate professor at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences in the Department of Family and Preventive Medicine. She also directs the state's mental health consultation. Well, with that, Carrie, I'd like to turn it over to you to get us started in this topic.
Great. It's so great to join everyone today, and we're excited to be here. And I think I'm just going to hop right in because Nikki and I are excited to getting to the talking and discussion part of today's webinar. So what we're going to do is just make sure that we're all on the same page about what it is about expulsion and suspension that we know, what makes it complex, and so that as we talk about and think with you about the role of quality improvement and the QRIS systems that states have been developing, that we're working from the same baseline. Nikki's going to share with us Arkansas's work to date and what they're learning and where they are on their path, and then I'll end up with some reflections about state policy, the role of it, some things to keep in mind, what we're seeing about possibilities, and then we would like to really just get into a conversation with all of you, learn from you, as well as share where we can go deeper or talk about what's most interesting for you. All right. Let's talk about definitions. In generally, right, in this field, we don't call it expulsion until very recently. What we said here is, please pick up your child early today, or please don't bring her in tomorrow. Maybe we need like a little break or reboot, or why don't you have him join us for half days for the next few weeks and see if reduced number of hours will help with what's going on. Or to really kind of what expulsion really looks like is saying, I don't think your child can stay with us. Our program just isn't right, or we can't seem to provide the services that he needs. We have some official definitions that you can use. I don't know if this has come across your path, but there is a recent guide that's come out called the Program Leaders Guide to Supporting All Children's Success that's geared to directors who are running early childhood programs that helps them look at their policies and practices inside their program. And here you can see they provide a continuum of what it means to have exclusionary practices, from everything from remove a child from activities that include other children to formal expulsion, which means dismissing a child permanently. Why I often flag their definition is because they've really put out there and have a definition for soft expulsion, which is it's the practices of the program that encourages families to voluntarily terminate the services. We saw in a survey in a state of their child care providers, when they were asked the questions, what's the first thing you do when faced with a challenging behavior, the overwhelming response from the providers was, I called the parent and asked them to pick up the child early. Well, if you do that a lot, I think that we all can assume the parent's going to be like, I have to remove my child from this service and try to find another kind. So we'll come back to this concept of soft expulsion because we want to make sure that our policies and our support aren't unintentionally aggravating soft expulsion and kind of driving some of these exclusionary practices underground. Caring for our children has some very clear definitions. You hear them briefly summarized here. They're a little longer in the edition that I cite below. And I also highlight them because, as well as kind of giving formal definitions for expulsion and suspension for the field, they also highlight other concerning behaviors that people might want to think about as we think about what's happening inside programs around what kinds of services are being eliminated based on children's perceived challenging behaviors, things like denying outdoor time, withholding food, or using food as a reward or punishment. So what does the research tell us? Well, the whole reason we're talking about this is, in and itself, suspension and expulsion are a stressful event and can have a negative impact on child outcomes, and that we know that the earlier it happens in a child's education predicts it happening more and later in their education, and that young children who are expelled and suspended are as much as 10 times more likely to later on drop out of high school, fail a grade, or be incarcerated. So we really are impacting the trajectory of our children with this kind of practice. The original research that really brought this to a forefront, and I think put this on the tip of everyone's tongue, was the 2005 research that Walter Gilliam from Yale released, where his team interviewed publicly funded pre-K teachers that could be in a variety of settings, including child care, Head Start, public schools, about what were their practices and had they asked the child to leave in the past year. And what you can see here is kind of the rate that brought this to everyone's forefront, that K-12 has about a rate of 2.1 kids per every 1,000 that are asked to leave in a year. Pre-K has 6.7 kids, and then child care has 27 children per 1,000 that are asked to be expelled in a past year. So how do we understand what he found? Well, he found data to show what would increase the likelihood of when expulsion would happen, and he really found these kind of three strikes. The first strike is that if you're an older boy, so you can see here that boys are 3.5 times more likely than girls to be expelled, and 4-year-olds are 50% more likely than 3-year-olds to be expelled. A second strike is really around equity issues, so it's really around black children. They're expelled at 2 times the rate of white children and 5 times the rate of Asian children. And from our civil rights data with our Department of Education, we can see that they make up about 18% of enrollment, but 48% of the children suspended for more than once. And then the third strike is around the setting. So we know that there are certain characteristics of programs that increase the likelihood of a child being expelled. So those programs that have high teacher-child ratios. The second one is around teacher stress. So, for example, classrooms with teachers that reported feeling highly stressed were 3 times as more likely to have expelled a child. And some of the quotes that they shared around kind of the hopelessness feeling that teachers expressed, it was things like, this child's classroom's behaviors are not likely to improve significantly. There's little that I or anyone else can do to significantly improve this child's classroom behavior. The child's parents will not be much help in improving this child's behavior. You can see that also that if a program has very little structure or has very highly restrictive, every moment of the day is accounted for, both of those situations increases the likelihood of expulsion. And then they found that if teachers and programs don't have access to some kind of consistent mental health or behavioral consultant to help them problem solve and think about what they're observing, what they could be doing, that increases. Private and faith-based child care is also on the list because they often fall under less licensing and regulation rules, and so probably are more likely to have some of these setting characteristics that lead to expulsion. The other thing I wanted to add to make sure that it's clear is that as you look at these risks around boys and girls and around race, is to understand that these are multiplicative and that they add up as you start to put them together. So, for example, a 4-year-old black boy is exponentially more at risk than a white or Asian 3-year-old girl, so that these things do add up and compound the risk for expulsion. We would also like to make the case that this is not a 3- and 4-year-old issue, and that as you think about your efforts to really think about a birth to 5 approach, and we even know that some states are looking into the early grades and maybe considering up to 3rd grade when they think about early childhood and what are systems, expulsion and suspension policies and practices. So here you can see there was an older study done in Chicago around child care programs that were serving the birth to 3 population, and that they found that 42% of the programs expelled at least 1 child in the previous year. A recent study just came out in the past year in 2017 in Philadelphia found that 26% of their child care programs had expelled at least 1 child in the past year, and that toddlers were just as likely as preschoolers to be asked to leave. So as we think about both what are the supports that we want to provide to families and children as they grow up and enter into preschool settings, but we also want to think about our children birth to 3 who are in care situations, and that there might be, even though we don't have strong research, just a couple of states from cities, that kind of a birth to 5 approach is necessary. We also wanted to kind of present to you that there are 3 dimensions of expulsion to consider as we try to understand why this is happening and kind of what is the role of state policy and how we might want to approach our strategy in trying to decrease and ultimately eliminate it. And these 3 that I wanted to highlight for you dimensions, I'm going to go through some pretty quick research summaries to give you a sense of these 3 areas, but that we, I think, distributed to people who signed up for today a handout. You would have had a PDF that for each bullet point that I'm about to go through actually has a paragraph, and then we've included citations. So if you would like to use this information or see it more spelled out where we give you a lot more information than this quick summary, you can go to that for more detail. So the first dimension is really around the lack of knowledge that we have about child development in our workforce. And so what you'll see in the handout is kind of a laying out kind of a logic that as we think about children's social emotional development being part of a context of their full development, that challenging behavior is part of development and really offers touch points for opportunities for growth and development and for adults to foster and promote development. And it was our own T. Barry Brazelton who coined the term touch points. That there are cross-cultural differences in the expressions of emotions and behaviors that we need to take the time to understand, so we may be understanding what the child is trying to tell us, and that therefore expulsion can really pathologize child behavior and increase disparities. What I wanted to highlight here for you is that a 2012 national survey of early care and education indicated that only about 20% of providers reported receiving training on facilitating social emotional growth in the past year. And without enough training, it may be difficult to distinguish concerning behaviors from those that are developmentally appropriate, and that we're mischaracterizing behaviors so that could be leading to inappropriate responses and labeling of children. So you see here a list of ideas of the kinds of things that we would really like the workforce to know and have skills around that would help create the foundation for understanding children's behavior and how we must best respond to it in the situation. The second dimension is really around implicit bias. And so we want to strongly communicate that the kind of expulsion rates that we're seeing in the early years and the kind of disparities cannot be explained by child behavior alone. We start to lay out that case under kind of what is the knowledge base around child development. And the second one is really here around implicit bias. Now, implicit bias is a human condition. We all have it. It's based on how the human brain works. And it's really about that we have behaviors and beliefs that are incongruent with our conscious state of beliefs, like that are implicit. And so there are several things that we highlight in the document that we've distributed, but the things that I've chosen to pick here is one is to really share with you the research from Stanford University that shows that underprepared early learning teachers are more likely to use punitive discipline and are more likely to over-identify children, especially children of color, for special education, discipline action, and expulsions, and that they appear to lack the skills to teach problem-solving behaviors and often misinterpret what children do and say. The early childhood longitudinal study found that at kindergarten entry that Black and white parents equally rated their children's non-cognitive skills that included things like persistence, approaches to learning, and social interactions. But that the teachers rated the Black students as having a distinct disadvantage in this area relative to white students. And then we have the recent study coming out of Yale and Walter Gilliam using eye tracking technology, where they found that preschool teachers, regardless of their race, tended to more closely observe Black children, especially Black boys, than white children when they were expecting a challenging behavior. They found a distinguishment that white teachers appeared to hold Black preschoolers to a lower behavioral standard, whereas Black teachers held Black preschoolers to a higher standard, but in general then tended to recommend harsher exclusionary discipline. So what you see captured here and what they reflected on is that these biases, though different, appear to actually share the expectation that Black children will have more frequent challenging behaviors, and that's where the implicit bias is coming in. The study also looked at whether knowledge about family background would help. So the teachers were provided background information that may explain a problematic child behavior. And the teachers of the same race as the child showed greater empathy for the child, which may lead to feelings that the challenging behaviors could improve, the researchers surmised. However, this information did not have the same impact on teachers when the child was of a different race, the teachers actually rated those child as having rated the behavior as more severe. So the researchers concluded from this research that the background information may lead to actually feelings of hopelessness and a sense that the child's challenging behaviors were insurmountable. They found these findings as consistent of other kinds of studies where that people tend to show greater empathy for misfortune of others when rating someone of their own race. They also reflected on the role and potential intervention of supports like early childhood mental health consultation, where this kind of feeling of hopelessness, and how do I understand this information, that when you are in a relationship with someone like a mental health consultation, that might be a way to intervene. And I think the takeaway here is really on that this background information had mixed impact. So as we think about what we want to encourage around family partnerships and engagement and the kinds of continuum supports we want to offer, I think we have to think about what closes the loop, and that partial information might not actually get us the results that we're hoping for. And then our third continuum does really have a surround around children, that there are children who need something more. So we have this that we know kind of across the population that somewhere between 10 to 14% of our children ages birth to 5 will have some kind of emotional relationship or behavioral disturbance where they'll need additional supports outside of what a traditional early learning setting can provide. That children are experiencing trauma, and that when they do, they arrive to school less ready to learn, and that violence, that exposure to violence can diminish things like concentration, memory, and language abilities, and the way that we might discover that is through their behavior. So this means as we think about the continuum of what we want to provide, there are going to be a percentage of kids that are going to need something more. But I think what I also want to leave for our conversation around quality improvement is it also means the quality of our early learning settings are even more important. Because this doesn't mean that these children who've experienced trauma shouldn't be in an early learning setting. It actually means that it's even more crucial, and that quality becomes important because they are less resilient in the face of lower quality. So we'd be happy to explore some of that a little further with you. I wanted to offer just a few reflections for you. I'm sure many of you have heard Walter Gilliam speak, and I think we've heard him say, and I wanted to reiterate here, that expulsion is not a child behavior, it's actually an adult decision. I argue that eliminating expulsion is the goal, but not necessarily the policy, especially as we look at trying to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences around exacerbating soft expulsions and kind of driving exclusionary practices underground. And that we hope that we show you that the kind of complexity that we're laying out means that a state response can't be a single factor problem. There isn't just one thing a state can do. It actually requires a multi-pronged approach and supports. And given any kind of state's makeup of your strengths, histories, what kinds of services and supports you have will dictate kind of like where any given state will start and what you'll kind of try to build toward over town. And as I get ready to turn this over to Nikki so we can hear concretely one state example about how they're trying to approach this work, I did want to acknowledge the feelings of why is this and why does it feel complex? And I think what we've heard is that there's actually subjectivity in what behavior is considered challenging. That we have many types of exclusionary practices that are happening, and that program characteristics can actually provoke or contribute to a child's behavior. So this isn't just about children. We have an increasing understanding about how implicit bias affects children of color, but I think as a field we're still trying to figure out, so what does that mean for how we must change how we do our practices, our professional development, and our sports. And that we're still actually, as I talked about when I launched this, is that expulsion suspension is really a symptom that our broader early childhood system isn't as well developed as we would want it to be, and it's not working how we want, and that there may be across the country a lack of supports for a generally underprepared workforce, and that these are some of the things that expulsion and suspension can highlight, that those things are still going on and might also be an effective issue to use to try to get the kind of resources and supports that we need across the early learning field. So with that, I look forward to our conversation about the role of state policy, but we thought we'd turn it over to Nikki to talk about this more concretely about Arkansas's experience.
Great, thanks, Carrie. So hello from Arkansas. This is Nikki Edge. Good morning or good afternoon to you, depending on where you live. I am going to talk and kind of provide an overview of how we have taken steps over about the last 2 years in Arkansas to sort of tackle this issue. I'll speak a little bit about how we developed a plan, kind of what our approach would be. I'll talk a little bit about how we rolled that out and what that looked like, and then what our experience has been implementing new policies and new support systems, and kind of where we're still learning and adapting and growing as we think about our next steps on this issue. So by way of just a little bit of background, in 2015, we were really prompted by the policy statements that came out of the Department of Ed and Administration for Children and Families, really challenging states to take some steps to reduce suspensions and expulsions. And as well, we knew some changes would be coming in the Child Care and Development Block Grant reauthorization that, again, would be encouraging us to really think about kids' social and emotional development. And so in 2015, we established a work group to really begin to explore this issue, co-chaired by a dynamic woman named Arlene Rose, who's the Assistant Director of our DHS Division of Child Care and Education. And I'll just call it the Division of Child Care for short because that's really quite a mouthful. And then I co-chaired with her representing our state's mental health consultation system. So you can see on the screen who all the internal to DHS partners were and external partners were. And really, in terms of those external partners, we were already thinking ahead to who would all of our potential helpers be if we were going to do something by way of a support system in our state. And so we tried to make sure that we had all of our professional development providers represented, that we had other partners who are already looking at this issue, like our friends in special ed, as well as our Division of Behavioral Health. And we began to meet together monthly and really look at the 6 sort of areas that the federal guidance said were part of this puzzle, and that you can't really just tackle one thing. You know, policy is not enough. Workforce building is not enough. You need kind of a package approach. And so we really looked at what we could do, big or small, in each of these areas. And some we addressed more strongly and thoroughly than others. And then I'm going to highlight mostly just 2 of them today. Kind of what did we end up with as a policy approach, and then how did we sort of strengthen some specialized supports for providers who are really in the thick of it, trying to figure out how to support a child and a family. And so I'll share a little bit about how that ended up looking for us. So I will say that of all the policy approaches that I've been hearing about to limiting suspension and expulsion, I really think that Arkansas's approach is about as simple as it gets. So for years, we have had a policy in state pre-K that basically says you can't expel without getting permission from the Division of Child Care. The limitations to that was it only covered state-funded pre-K. There was no real system for monitoring it. There was no real system for supporting programs that were struggling. We didn't even have data on how often it happened. But it provided a foundation. It provided a start. And so in July of 2016, this very simple policy statement was embedded in the participant agreement for our voucher providers so that we would have a consistent policy across our state and federal funded programs. And of course, as you guys know, Head Start has had their own longstanding expulsion prevention policies. And so if you take our 3 policies together, it covers about 75% of early care and education in Arkansas. So the pros to that is that it was, that's an easy state policy statement to write, right? And putting that statement in the voucher provider agreement was very easily implemented, more so than passing legislation or other approaches. But what we all know, and as Carrie has, I think, highlighted, is that expulsion is no simple issue. It's really complex. There are no simple solutions. And so for us, while we have a simple policy, the complexity really sits in the support system, which I'll describe. And that's where we try to address the fact that this is a really multifaceted problem. Let's see. So I just want to briefly show, I'm sure most of you have seen the social emotional pyramid, and I show that only to say that as we thought about how we would set up a support system in Arkansas that would prevent expulsion, we really wanted to be mindful of what the pyramid model tells us about this. which is that this is not just about intensive intervention for individual children. This is really about supporting programs and developing the full range of practices that support kids' social and emotional development and promote positive behavior. And so that's we've tried to keep that in mind as we have shaped our system. I'm just seeing a note that I'm a little bit fuzzy, so I'm going to try to pick up the handset and see if that improves things. Hopefully you can hear me more clearly now. Our next concern that we had as we were thinking about how to shape a support system was how on earth would we ever figure out what teacher needed what kind of support? As you think about all the things that influence children's behavior and social emotional development, we were challenged to think about, if a teacher doesn't know and understand that this problem might not lie solely in the child, that there might be a connection between how the classroom environment is operating and this child's behavior. If she doesn't have that knowledge base, then it's going to be hard for us for her to articulate to us what she needs. We also knew from our history of providing mental health consultation that there's not a deep knowledge base among many of our teachers and directors about how children's other experiences connects to their behavior, that something difficult that child might have experienced or traumatic that they might have experienced could be influencing their behavior. So again, getting the right kind of help and support was going to be tricky. So we decided that we really wanted to develop a support system where somebody would have the capacity to go lay eyes on the situation. A teacher could throw up her hand and say, I need help. I'm not sure how to support this child in the best way, and someone could come out, observe, think with them about the strengths in the classroom, think about interactions between teachers and children, and think about the support that would be most helpful. So that led us to the next conversation. Who on earth in our state is already going on-site into programs that knows anything about any level of the pyramid? So, of course, we have a mental health consultation program, a small one, and we have some technical assistance providers in our state. And so we had some sense that we would see, kind of a full range of needs, a full range of classroom types that we would be entering and different levels of concerns. We knew that sometimes behavior concerns are going to emerge in classrooms where just the basics of developmentally appropriate practice are kind of spotty. And so that, who can go help teachers with those basics, with schedules, routines, transitions, curriculum, relationship building. We also knew that kids are getting kicked out for some things that are developmentally normal. We know that there are times that toddlers are going to bite in a group care setting. And so who knows how to respond to just common typical behavioral challenges? And then who do we have in our state that can handle the next level cases when behavior really is sounding atypical and concerning? And so we identified two main teams of potential helpers, technical assistance providers and mental health consultants, and I'll say more about each of those groups in a minute, who exactly they are, what their background was, how we found them, and kind of how they're approaching this work. So what we ended up with was developing a system that was basically just pulling a bunch of existing resources together, strengthening some of those resources, and creating kind of a single point of entry for serious behavior-related problems in childcare. We call the system BehaviorHelp because we thought that that would be something that teachers would remember. And so the system starts with an online brief help request. So a teacher, a director, a parent, a therapist, anybody can submit a brief online form that basically says, here's who I am and I need help around challenging behavior in childcare. And then from there, it's a three-tiered system, with cases moving up the tiers based on what we understand to be the nature of the case, the severity of the situation, the red flags we're hearing about things this child might have experienced or ways in which this child is already multi-system involved. And we'll look closer at those tiers in the next few slides. And so I'm going to just kind of walk you up the different levels and tell you how cases sort of get sorted. So the first thing that happens when a help request comes in is that we have who you might think of as triage specialists within our Division of Child Care. So these are folks who are carving out time for this role in basically other duties as assigned. So these are people that work in the voucher program. These are people who are pre-K specialists. These are people whose primary duties is something else. And then one day a week, they take their turn fielding these requests. So the commitment is that once a request comes in, we'll contact the referral source, usually the director or the teacher, to complete a structured interview within 2 days. And then they can either handle the case themselves by providing some brief phone support, email assistance, or they can assign it to technical assistance or early childhood mental health consultation. And then we all sit together in a weekly staffing where we kind of look at some of these cases together and figure out where we need to shift and adapt. And I'll talk about how important that's been to our work as we go on. So in that interview, this is a structured interview that takes anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes, and they're really trying to figure out, what do we know about this center? What do we know about the teacher? Kind of what else are we hearing in terms of the intensity of the teacher's frustration, or things that don't sound quite right to us related to strategies that they're trying, and then what do they know about this child and their history and behavior. And really they're incorporating this information to try to make a decision about who is the best helper for this case. So if the case sounds sort of typical, it doesn't sound too extreme, then the case is going to go to technical assistance. And the TA provider will have the information from this interview to help jumpstart their involvement. Then there are certain red flags. That means that the case is likely to go to a mental health consultant if one can at all become available, and that's foster care involvement, known serious trauma, prior mental health diagnoses, involvement in other systems. And of course, when we're not sure what to do, we make these decisions together in our staffings that we hold weekly. So the majority of our cases are actually handled by this brilliant group of technical assistance providers that operate out of one of our big universities that has had a large early childhood services unit for many, many years. Again, these are people who are varied in their background, and all of them have other duties. So some are trainers of various early care and education curriculum. Some have had a role as a coach on a program like Conscious Discipline. Others have provided general TA to child care in the state, or they were part of a team that supported centers in moving up the quality rating system. And now they spend part of their days handling BehaviorHelp cases. So we have between 25 and 30 of these TA providers, again, keeping in mind none of them are full-time committed to this work. They're all engaged in other work, but we're really handpicked for their skill set and knowledge related to social emotional development and their willingness and ability to get out there in the classroom and support teachers in this work. So at this level, we are really focusing on the classroom environment. We're not thinking about this as a child-specific service, although it may have been a concern about one or two children that got us in that classroom. But they're really arming teachers with strategies that are likely to work for the cases that they're seeing now and in the future. They're talking about schedules and routines. They're talking about relationship buildings. They're talking about calm down strategies. And so it's really a broader and more general approach. Then when we see those red flags that tell us we're really going to have to think carefully as a team about how to support a specific child and family and their teacher that has some really unique needs because of a trauma history, because of foster care involvement, because of some things that have already been going on, then we really want to try to get that case to a mental health consultant. So this happens only with parents' consent and involvement. And here, a specially trained, licensed mental health professional goes and partners with that teacher and that center and visits 1 to 2 times per week for 3 months. And so they're observing, they're helping develop behavior plans, they're working on screenings and referrals to community resources, they're working with that teacher to implement some of the strategies that they've decided on together in the classroom, and
and oftentimes facilitating dialogue between teacher, director, and parent, and really working hard to help prop up that teacher, encourage her, support that teacher's well-being who may be operating in a very stressed environment in a very stressful situation. I show this map just to say we have 13 mental health consultants for our whole state, and they're in the locations that you can see. And so the gaps in services should probably be obvious to you based on this map. So we're not everywhere we need to be, and we're really creative in the way that we do things to try to reach some of those holes in the state. We also have had to be very creative in the way in which we collaborate with some of our other partners like special ed or our technical assistance providers when we can't get somewhere. When we can't get somewhere, we provide support to those other helpers so that they can think about how trauma might be affecting the situation. Or how they think about community referrals for a child and family. And so we're sort of sometimes consultants to the other helpers in our system. And of course, the reason that there are not enough of us is partly financial, and it's partly just a workforce issue, which kind of leads me to that conversation. Everyone always wants to know, how did we finance this? People are pretty intimidated by financing a big expulsion prevention system. And basically, we say we funded it creatively and on the cheap. So most of this was about looking at existing contractors who are already working out in the world of early care and education funded by the Division of Child Care, and thinking about how do we shift job duties, how do we shift resources, how do we reallocate. Each of us who have been doing different kinds of work in this area for a while ended up rebudgeting, reallocating, redeploying to try to collectively use our resources to create a system that was going to be supportive for all. The influx of money that did come was an investment to add about 5 mental health consultants. So we did grow our program to the tune of 5 new 3-day-a-week mental health consultants. So again, not a huge investment of new funds. So I'm going to share some data that's a little out of date now. You can see is basically our experience in our first year, which was a wild ride, and just to highlight a few data pieces and a few of our lessons learned. So as we right before we launched our new system, we gathered some data from our directors. We surveyed about 500 of our early care and education program directors. Because we wanted to kind of understand our baseline. What are the numbers we're trying to budge? And so you can see on this slide about 9% of our directors reported having a recent expulsion of a child. And the majority, were engaged in some kind of exclusionary classroom practice. And so we knew we had our work cut out for us. We also did mandatory trainings regionally across the state for all of our funded providers, for providers that take vouchers, for providers that take state pre-K dollars. And then we surveyed them and basically said, did we convince them that there's a reason for this initiative, and then how are they feeling about it now? So these trainings were as much a sales pitch about expulsion as anything else. So really helping them understand the negative consequences of expulsion, the disparities, and what that means for kids. And basically what they told us at the end of those sessions was that they were worried. This is going to be a big change for them, but also that they got it. They had not been exposed to this research on the whole. They didn't know that they were engaged in any kind of practice that could potentially be damaging to a child's trajectory. And they wanted to change, and they wanted to adapt if they have support. And so that is what this past year has been about for us. This is, again, outdated. We've had almost 400 cases now in our expulsion prevention system since we launched. The dark blue that you see are our more populous parts of the state, and that's where many of our referrals have been. But those gray counties, I just show this map to say, we're out there in some very rural areas in which there are very few supports for families, very few mental health supports. And, I know that some of you are in similar states like that, and thinking about how you operate in those counties is a potential challenge. I want to make sure that I kind of reinforce some of what Carrie was talking about as she talks about what the research tells about us, because it certainly has borne out in our experience that expulsion is complex. It is about this sort of array of issues about the child and the family and about what's going on in a program. And from the very beginning, we saw this full range of cases. So referrals coming into our BehaviorHelp system were everything from, a perfectly typically developing child in a very supportive family engaged in very typical behaviors in the classroom, like a toddler that bites or a preschooler that occasionally hits, all the way to the most extreme behaviors that you can imagine that were happening in the aftermath of trauma in a highly stressed family system. On the program side, same thing, full range. We saw incredibly nurturing caregivers in the most high-quality centers, really anxious to put their heads together with a TA provider and think about strategies to help a child succeed. We had other programs where, our consultants would come back and talk to the licensing department to say, wow, how has nobody noticed that this child care center, they have 7 toys in the whole room for 12 kids. How do we think that there's not going to be behavior problems? So we really did see kind of that full range of experience right out of the gate. We also learned very quickly that everybody in our system, from our trainers who are out there talking about this system, to the triage staff, to our TA providers and consultants, we would have to be ready to really understand and support providers who have very real concerns, who are really caught between a rock and a hard place, afraid their teacher is going to quit, afraid parents are going to pull their children out because their child got hit again. Providers who really don't understand that there's no place else for this child to go, that there's not some magical center that's better able to meet the child's need. And so we had to become savvy and develop our resources for kind of communicating to these concerns very quickly on. So just a little bit about who we've seen, how it's worked. As I've said, the majority of our cases are things that are handled at the technical assistance level. So really looking at that, how do we support teachers and just having good classroom practices that are going to support this child and all children. And then about a third of the cases go to mental health consultation. It should be that the numbers should be closer to 30-35%. There were times that we were so strapped for mental health consultants last year. Again, not every case we would have assigned, not every case that needed a mental health consultant got it, and sometimes we had to provide consultation to other helpers and other systems. We serve the full age range, but the bulk of our referrals, as the national data would show, are those 4-year-olds, and it's those 4-year-old boys. We haven't seen as much disparity in race as we might have expected. We're a little overrepresented in African American kids, certainly relevant to our population, but not necessarily relative to our the makeup of our federally and state-funded early care and education composition. And then what are they referred for? So on the intake form, they talk about the challenging behaviors that they're experiencing, and it's a range, but it's most commonly serious, aggressive, and sort of off-task behavior. So this is a child who's struggling to pay attention, has difficulty following routines, and who's hitting, kicking, biting, and spitting. What probably should have been obvious to us, but we weren't necessarily prepared for, was that we would have a large volume of cases where on the front end, providers know that there has been something potentially traumatic that children have experienced. So this has been about 1/3 of our cases where this is a child that's experienced abuse or neglect, the recent death of a sibling, a violent death of a parent, something pretty significant that even before we go in, this is kind of known in the community. Now, I want to say that I'm going to share a story right here to give you sort of a feel for the kind of cases that we get, and I want to let you know that this story has a disturbing element in it or about domestic violence. And so if you feel like that might be upsetting to you or triggering to you, feel free to mute your phone or do what you need to do to take care of yourself, and then when you see me flip the slide, you'll know that I'm done with that story. So, the words on the slide that you're seeing here are how we might describe a case, but I know that those words don't actually tell the story. And so I want to share a little bit about a child that I'm going to call Jessie. We've changed a few details. We've actually combined a couple of cases to reflect the kind of cases that we see that are more extreme, but to also protect the privacy of the children, families, and providers. So when the director made this referral into BehaviorHelp, she said that Jessie had been a time bomb and that she never knew when he was going to go off. Jessie hits, pulls hair, spits, curses, and throws things. He runs out of the room. He actually got outside onto the playground by himself the day before the referral. He threw a chair at his teacher. He told another child he would shoot him. The teacher is threatening to quit and other parents are complaining. The teacher is a long-term sub and the center doesn't know how they will ever find someone to take this class if she walks out. Jessie's already receiving special education services and has a behavior interventionist. The behavior interventionist has said, I need more help, and has facilitated this referral to the BehaviorHelp system. He's been referred to therapy services, but we don't think he's going. Jessie lives with his grandfather. They're trying to send him to his aunt because his grandparents can't manage his behavior. So we said, what else do you know about Jessie? Has he had any changes in his life recently? Why does Jessie live with his grandfather? And the director says, well, yes, it's a sad story. We've been told that Jessie's dad beat his mother to death last year. His dad is in prison now. In fact, they say that Jessie was found covered in his mother's blood. We wonder if this has something to do with the way that he's acting, but we don't know what that means, and we don't know what to do with it, and we don't know if there's any way to help Jessie. So in many of our cases, these are the kinds of referrals that we're getting. And I share that story to say this has been one of our biggest challenges. A story like Jessie's means there's no quick and easy fix. Jesse's going to need a team around him that's skilled and trauma-informed and patient and supportive. You're going to need mental health professionals on your team, ready to take a case like Jesse's. And you're going to need to support all of your helpers, including the people that answer the phone and hear these stories, so that they don't wind up with symptoms of secondary trauma. You're going to need strong referral partners in your community because Jesse and his family are going to need ongoing support. And so you're going to have to think about how the Jessies, and we've had about 100 Jessies referred to us, impact every level of your system and across your systems in your state. And so that's been one of our biggest challenges and learnings of the past year. I am going to whiz through the next couple slides because I think I'm about out of time. But there is one other piece that I want to emphasize. In spite of the challenges and in spite of the difficulty of some of these cases, we have had a lot of success. So we have avoided expulsion in more than 90% of cases. We'll have an annual report coming out soon that kind of breaks that down, what the different variations on that look like. But our biggest bright spot has been the communication and coordination across our whole, what we call our whole response team. So the state staff at the Division of Child Care, our TA providers, and our mental health consultants. And a real key to that is that we spend about 2 hours together every week, staffing cases together, trading cases, getting help when we're stuck, figuring out where these cases should go. We've also done a lot of co-training together. It has been also critical that in those meetings that our different state leadership teams are represented. Child care licensing is an example of that. So they have to be at the table to hear about centers that we're in where we have concerns about the basic care that's happening for all kids. And it's the same with our state pre-K leadership. They have to be at the table so that they can be part of supporting the programs that are in their portfolio. And so that's been really, really key to the success. So I'm going to skip over some slides that just show basically teachers like us and teachers would use us again. And I think I've really spoken to many of the challenges, the needs outweighing the resources to some degree, especially where our mental health consultants are concerned, the volume of referrals for kids with extensive needs, and the need for better kind of community partners able to provide treatment and kind of next level services. So that's been some of our experience in Arkansas, and I think there'll be a time for questions as we go on later. Carrie, I guess I'm turning it back to you.
Okay, so as we think about what Nikki laid out for us, both on your questions for her specifically about Arkansas, but as we pull back up to say what can we take from her conversation about what's going on in your state and what you have uniquely pulled together and what you can do. Here's a picture we wanted to offer you about the potential components to consider when developing a state strategy to reduce expulsion. And we'll talk a little bit about maybe where to specifically do you see where quality improvement or QRIS fit in specifically, as well as where you might be part of that coordination partnership team that Nikki just highlighted at the end. So you can see here these four big buckets, the colored columns, give you kind of the 4 buckets of areas of potential work. And then it goes into and gives you some kind of the categories. And what I'll highlight is that we have a policy strategies tool that states can use that would then break down those blue squares for you into concrete policy recommendations for a state to consider so that you could kind of outline where does your state already have strength, where are you already doing work that you might want to bring attention to? So then out of the stuff that you're not doing, there's a few crucial items raised to the top of what you would really like to implement. So what you heard from Nikki's story is that there's one bucket around, is there a clear state goal about what you're trying to do? Do you have a governance team? Are you using something you already have in existence like an early learning council? Or are you creating a unique team to work on this? And what kind of data do you have available and what data do you want to create going forward? You see, the second bucket is really around concrete policy. So you heard Nikki's state policy of a very simple one is that you have to get permission before you can expel. But other states have explored different things in legislation or licensing or doing it by funding stream. And then what is the protocol that you're asking people to do? Sometimes some states give very little guidance. Some other states like Arkansas give a very specific, here you have to engage in these steps before expulsion can even be considered. And then it's actually not considered. The whole goal is to avoid it. You can see that there then are kind of lowercase policy ideas that you could have around the program characteristics. So that's what we got. That it goes with what we heard from Gilliam's research about things like ratio or length of the day or staffing patterns or use of curriculum. There are some specific ideas around child care assistance because eligibility and participation in child care kind of works differently than preschool and Head Start in most states. So there's some specific ideas around continuity of care and quality child care. And then you see work conditions about what are the conditions that people are working in that would help them reduce the likelihood of expulsion happening. The third bucket is really around the kinds of support. So you heard that one of the new things that Arkansas implemented was a triage concept. So they're doing an online version. We've heard from Ohio that they've implemented a phone line through their children's hospital. So there's a couple of states that we could learn from, going deeper about that. You hear her talking about the use of trainers, quality improvement specialists from the QRIS, mental health consultants, to kind of do both sides of the coin, right? Trying to think about how to do the prevention promotion work that will help us ultimately prevent expulsion from happening. But in the meantime, we also need the triage and mental health consultant and coaching kind of to help with the fire situation. What's on fire, what kids at risk, and how do we get in and then see what's going on. And then you can see in her example with Jessie that there's ongoing kind of what are the kind of services we have, where are they available, do people know about them, how are they connected. So I've heard some states that actually have some further more health and mental health services than Arkansas might have, but they were fully admitting to me, well, they're not connected to any part of the early learning system, so they're not really clear about what kind of referrals could actually be happening. So each state has their own unique take on these 4 areas about what you might put together for a strategy and how you might include quality improvement in that. And you can see that across all of this work is actively thinking about the involvement of families and how we're supporting programs and building partnerships with families, as well as making sure that we're not exacerbating equity issues around implicit bias, but actually promoting and decreasing disparities. All right, so we wanted to give you an example of how this might feel, or the kinds of questions that a state might answer if they kind of take on one of these buckets and look at the tool. So you see this one highlighted around the alignment of TA providers. So we wanted to take a pause here and do a poll, and we thought we would just use the chat box. So we wanted to hear from you about how many types of different technical assistant providers do you think you have in your state visiting early learning programs? You see, I think, 7 ideas up here on the screen where we thought about, okay, QRIS improvement specialists, you might have health consultants, maybe you have mental health consultants, maybe infantile specialists, maybe you're involved in the pyramid model and have coaches, maybe you have coaches tied to specific initiatives or trainings, maybe you have licensing. So we just wanted to see if you could give us a feel for your state as you think about, are there other kinds of technical assistant providers that you think you have in a state, and how many do you think your state has? And you can enter that right into the chat box. So far, we're seeing a range of 5 to 10. Some people don't know, which also lets you know, think about. So I'm starting to see kind of a range from 0 to the lowest number of people have multiples 3 up to 6 to 10. So there seems to be an average of around 4 to 5. And then people are like, well, maybe it depends on where they're being delivered and that kind of thing. So you can see that then as we're thinking about what kind of coherent, intentional strategy do you want to bring, is there work that you could do around your TA providers? So it's kind of thinking about who do you have, what kinds of programs are they reaching, because probably no one TA provider group is reaching all of your early learning programs worth of 5 across the state. So as you think about who's there and who could be delivering messages to programs or responding to the question, hey, we've been having a tough time with the kid. Do you have any insight? I know you're here for X, but could you help us with Y? Here's some questions that we would potentially have the tool ask states. And it's around, do you want your TA providers to all have a shared common knowledge? Is there a baseline, a minimum that everybody has no matter what kind of TA provider they are, about children's social emotional development, about implicit bias, about effective responses to challenge behaviors? We've heard from some states who anecdotally said, oh yeah, there's always that licensor who always sits to the program. Yeah, you should expel that kid because they're causing you problems and you're having a hard time doing these other things because of that one child. So it's kind of trying to pull those, minimally those messages and the kind of understanding that Nikki talked about, making the case for why this is important and what it is, to all the way to, is there a baseline knowledge? And then as you think about each of their expertise and what they're there to provide, do they all have a role, or what's the turf or niche for people to support programs' capacity in promoting adult-child interactions, building partnerships with families, and decreasing some of the things you heard in the research about the likelihood of expulsion? And then if people are going into programs, they may be hearing about kids that are at risk for expulsion. So what's their role? So if you do decide to set up a triage, or you decide that there is a mental health consultation program that programs could be contacting, is it the responsibility of any given TA provider to know that and to help programs to get where they're going? And then you heard from Nikki today that there might be specific roles of state quality improvement specialists as you think about how many you have, what their current workload is, what kind of gifts or expertise that they're coming to the table with, what you might do specifically around this topic. So I hope that gives you a flavor where the tool doesn't right now have any answers, but what it does is it takes the topic and asks some questions. The tool will specifically give individual policy recommendations, and there's a rating system, and the online system will keep track of your ratings online for you to print and share with others about where your states have strength, where you have some things in process, and where do you not have it. And then it asks a series of reflection questions about where you could do that work further. So when you signed up for the webinar, I believe our intent was to share this link with you in the official title of the tool. So if it's something that you would like to minimally skim and see the kinds of ideas that are in the tool, or how you might use it with a governance team or that kind of thing, is available for you. And what the tool does for you is it has kind of a lengthy introduction, because it's assuming that the people you might be working with in your state don't have all the knowledge that we outlined at the beginning about the research. So it gives you all the citations and the summary of what we went through. It then has the actual tool part where you assess your state's context and strengths and areas for improvement across the main bucket areas, and then it encourages the team to make some goals and put together their strategy based on what they have and what they'd like to do. And then it really kind of suggests trying to collect data and monitor progress. So you can see, if we come back to our chart, what I've highlighted here is for you to think about, like, where maybe specifically could quality improvement or your QRIS leadership be involved in a state strategy. And so what you see here is that maybe you're part of the leadership team already. You're thinking about kind of, you're informing program policies or requirements. So you can see here that there were lots of places that I had ideas of where quality improvement could be part of the area. And what we'd like to hear in the conversation is if you have concrete examples or questions that we can kind of explore. And so the tool gives a way that encourages a team approach, but it actually has a lot of flexibility in how it can be used, and whether you do a single section or you do all 6 sections that the tool has, or how you would like to work with it as a group intentionally or a little more ad hoc to inform your thinking. So the tool includes QRIS in some specific areas, so I just wanted to introduce these to give some food for thought. So you can see that there's around the kind of goals section of the policy, you can see that it's trying to make sure that you have a cross-system leadership team and that your quality improvement and QRIS team would be involved in that. In the second strategy, there's a lot of ideas around kind of the policies that either guide expulsion or guide program quality. But one of the things it specifically says about QRIS is around how it's tied to the cost of quality. So how are you thinking about how does child care assistance support the kinds of activities, reflections, skill sets that you want increasingly over time amongst your workforce is a type of cost of quality. And are we being honest with ourselves about what does that take, and how can we use this topic as a way to get the resources that you may need? Again, strong family partnerships has been integral, and here is where I wanted to highlight for you that the tool will have specific policy recommendations on how you might use some standards and indicators across QRIS tiers, but it actually then gives you resources embedded in the tool for a lot of the policy recommendations on where you might go. So if you decide, oh yeah, we want to review our QRIS tiers, rethink if there's a few powerful indicators, standards that we could have around family relationships and how our program's delivering that so they can even do family engagement, that there are some tools and resources that will be linked in the tool that you could potentially use. There's a lot in the tool around, as you can imagine, building a highly skilled workforce. And so some of the questions in there are around, does the QRIS include a progression to increase competencies across the tiers in social emotional knowledge and skills? And that's not all standards are created equal. So as you think about what is your QRIS reinforcing around adult-child interactions, building relationship with families, that kind of thing, that you would bring, it would bring a lens to review. So at the next time that you're kind of looking at your QRIS, you've just done it and you're going to do it again in a couple of years, that you're anticipating what lens you might bring to it. Or if you're about to review it now, you might use this tool earlier to kind of scan the recommendations to think about what you would want to do. One of the things I wanted to highlight was that I heard a state kind of thinking about, would they have a QRIS rating or point system where they would be reward points if they hadn't expelled a child in the last year. And my question to all of you is, how would you know if a program expelled a child in the last year, especially with soft expulsion behaviors? So maybe the QRIS should be incentivizing and giving points for, are programs accessing expulsion prevention supports? Do they use a mental health consultant if available? Are they going through a progression of trainings for their staff on social emotional content, how to handle challenging behaviors, how to implement trauma-informed care? So thinking about what is the QRIS actually incentivizing around things of this nature. And then we already highlighted kind of the technical assistance providers. So as we get into conversation, what I have here for your reflection is think about, does your state have an effort to decrease expulsion in birth of 5 programs? Do you know if the effort is multifaceted? Are they including quality improvement or QRIS leadership? And are you doing anything around, one of the things we didn't really talk to Nikki about, but she has her technical assistance providers and her mental health consultants are all doing an assessment tool to see what they are finding in the programs that they're entering. So that data could eventually inform things like professional development, higher education preparation, QRIS system of where are the gaps, where are the trends that you want to address. So as we think about how can, if there's work that others are doing, but can it create a feedback loop so that we're doing more promotion and prevention and there's less fires to put off. And then I have this question to consider of like, regardless of policy, what is your role in decreasing the likelihood of expulsion in early learning? And are there some things that you can do in your work every day, bringing this lens to your work? And as always, what are we doing to contribute to increasing racial and gender equity? Nikki and I have talked about, it's, on one hand, their data is very exciting that's not showing the disparities. But on the other hand, we don't really know right now how to use data to capture soft expulsions. And so who are we not being told about that are leaving programs? So we know that when the federal government came out with their policy statement a couple of years ago on this topic, one of their recommendations to the state was to collect data on all the reasons why children leave programs, so you can start to look at trends and different kinds of problems that you might want to resolve. No state, I think, has figured that out. But I think that's an interesting thing to challenge us as we continue to think about what our role is around promoting equity. And with that, I think I'll pause, Debbie, so that we can make sure we get some questions and discussion.
Yes. Nikki and Carrie, I appreciate what you've laid out so far, and we do have questions. And what I'd like to start with is some of the questions that were at the program level. And Nikki, I think I heard you address this a little bit, but if you can just, is there anything that you would add about how does one get a director and centers on board with the idea of changing their policies? We talked about the policy lever at the state level. Sometimes that doesn't reach as far into all of our early childhood programs. And I think I heard you offer the suggestion of basically education about what expulsion does to children and families, and that there are things that can be done to support programs in children. But is there anything else you'd add to that idea?
Yeah, I would just say that for us, you're right. Education, along with the policy change, has been key. So our providers, didn't really understand the negative outcomes of expulsion. And these are people who got in this work because they care for kids. And so that, just sharing that information was a really important first step. Also, we have been, it's not like they want to expel kids, right? Sometimes they're caught between a rock and a hard place. And so we can back them up with messages about what quality programs do, and that it's a sign of a quality program to take extra steps to support every child. And then that's an indicator of quality and something that they should be, something that they should be proud of. And so I think, just being able to have those honest conversations and those dialogues has been key. And for many of our providers, again, nobody feels good after you expel a child, and so it really has been not so hard to get them to just say, hey, we'll do anything we can if there's support. So I think it's just kind of that combination of education, making it clear there'll be support, and then having the policies, that backs it up.
And continuing down this line, really at the program and provider level, we often hear providers say, I've been to this training, but it won't work for this child, or another center would be better able to serve this child. What other type, is there anything more in terms of responses? We've talked about a number of things here that you've developed for these common ingrained perspectives.
Yeah.
We hear those types of comments all the time, and we're hearing, I think just hearing your language and how you're talking with providers is very helpful. Anything else there?
Yeah, so, the conversations about this other magical center that's going to be better able to the child, those are really, individual one-on-one conversations that we have, although we do address it in our trainings. But we really talk about, what would it look like to you? What kind of center do you think would be better able to support this child? And then usually they're telling us features that are just quality features of programs. And so if we're advocating for a child to stay in a program, if we're not advocating that we transition them out, that means they're already in a quality place. And so sometimes it's just about telling this program, you know what, you are the quality place. You're saying this child needs small teacher-child ratios. You offer as small a ratio as exists in our state. You say that, this child needs more one-on-one. Well, you know what? Actually, what we're seeing in this classroom is more individualized attention and high-quality teacher-child interactions than we see in most places. There isn't another place that we have that can offer better. And so sometimes it really is just a misunderstanding that they think something exists that's not them. And so kind of helping them understand how the quality features that they do offer are really just what this child needs. And then saying, and we're going to be here by your side, that can be helpful. The training piece, I've had that training, this won't work for that child, that's really where the on-site support is critical. Mm-hmm. So often what we see is, the teacher's been to training, but something along the way has prevented them from implementing what they learned. A lot of times they just get overwhelmed by the volume of knowledge that they took in a training and don't know where to start or how to put that into practice. And so having a TA provider or a consultant come in and give them some little place to start. I know that you're thinking conscious discipline, you're saying conscious discipline won't work for this child. Let's do this one I love you ritual every day with this child and see what happens. Let's do this one other thing. Let's start there. Because sometimes it's just that needing to break it down, needing to help think it through, put your heads together to commit to doing two things you learned at that training. And then, lo and behold, it does actually work. And so sometimes it is just about kind of helping them take what they learned, and implement it. And there's no substitute for that except for someone being kind of alongside them and helping them think about that.
Oh, that's so helpful. Thanks for that perspective. Now, bridging into the TA role, once the TA is provided and training occurs, what are the expectations about follow-up for that case? Like, how do you close a case? Is there a booster visit, a week, a couple of months later, or checking in? How do you handle that?
It really depends on the case. Some of our cases, are at that end of the spectrum where it closes so quickly and easily because really we just needed to tweak this and that, and the child just needed a little time to settle in, and we say, and we're here if you need us again. Other cases that are more serious require more visits, greater intensity, and then maybe a scaling back of support. And so, I see that you're implementing everything we've talked about. I think you've got it for next week. I'm going to skip a week and come back a little bit later and check in again, and then drifting that down to phone and email support at times, and then, as they're ready, saying, you know what, you have got this. But we're here if you need us again. You submit another help request if we understand things change. And so our TA side is really flexible in those ways. Our mental health consultation is a little bit more structured because every case is intense and we give every case kind of the maximum dose.
Yeah. And now we have go ahead.
No, that's it.
Okay. Well, we have a couple of questions about, now you deployed a lot of different people with a lot of different backgrounds. And we have questions in the chat box about competencies to do this work or training or supports to do this work. Do you have a mandatory something that, even subsidy person doing this initial triage work would go through? And then do you have any, and Carrie, maybe this is also to you, what have we heard about states developing core competencies for this work?
So, yeah, I can speak to our experience, and then Carrie can jump in. So it really has three different answers. So in our mental health consultation program, we've long had core competencies. We've long had a standard training because we're not a state where we just had a naturally, great infant mental health trained, workforce, mental health professionals that know all about the world of early care and education. That didn't exist here, right? So we long ago developed a certification process for our mental health consultants, and that's been in place. The TA side was different, as well as those triage staff. And I'm just going to be really honest here and say that mostly we just got really lucky because we were able to hand-pick folks who really had, we just had a sense that they had the right kind of knowledge base and the right kind of interpersonal skills to pull this off, and mostly we were right. We've had to figure out on the fly what kind of training do they actually need, what are actually the gaps in knowledge. We've come at that in part from kind of the pyramid model perspective, so like everybody that goes out to help needs to have some basic knowledge that they can bring at every level of the pyramid. They need to know how to help teachers build relationships with kids. They need to know some basics of developmentally appropriate practice. They need to know some basics of how you do some strategic social emotional skill building in classrooms. And so we train continuously and we train a lot together, but it's been pretty haphazard and just sort of addressing the needs as they come up. For the folks that answered the phone, the triage staff, the primary training that we did there is around active listening and around asking questions with empathy. They had to see their role as kind of de-escalators, that their part of the intervention is to hear and make people feel heard and understood and responded to. And so that was the primary training that they have received. So that's an area where we're growing and we're learning and we're figuring it out, and we did it on the fly.
Well, I'll tell you what, we can't wait to read the paper in 1 year, because that was just such a great explanation of at every level, and it's a different exertion in every level about what you focused on. But I know that we're all going to be interested to hear what you learned about the preparation and how you kind of parsed out those levels of information of expertise. Carrie, anything to add here?
No, I think this is where states are trying to find it out on the technical assistance level, and I think this is the challenge that's above before us, right? Like I saw the states here range from anywhere from 3 to 10 different types of technical assistant providers supporting programs. So I think as you think about the baseline of what is needed, and then are some of those technical assistants going to be paired with mental health consultants. And I think what states have out there is really wide-ranging. I think we have some states with large early childhood mental health consultation programs like Colorado and Arizona, where their consultants are doing the whole continuum of what Nikki's talking about, of working with programs from promotion through the difficult cases. Nikki had to make a hard choice in her state about the best use of her mental health consultants, which ended up with the pairing of the technical assistant providers providing the other side of the work. And so I think we're still learning and figuring this out about what baseline knowledge do you want in general, and then if they're playing this special role because you're putting together a strategy of how to put out the fires. I think we're still learning how to do that.
Thank you. I want to just mention we've had some comments in the chat box about states beginning to take data and figure out how to collect data on suspensions so they can understand the progress that they're making and how the policy and supports they're implementing are working for programs. And we see some other funding information and questions. But our time is winding down now. And so what I'd like to do is to ask each of you, what kind of a thought or idea would you like to leave the really great participants we've had on this session about the work that you've done, or the remember this or think about that? What would you share? Carrie, why don't we start with you?
I think I just want to say that maybe we could have a follow-up conversation about data, but I think it would have to be a joint problem-solving one. Don't you agree, Nikki? Because I think there's prevalence data about how often is it happening in your state, and do you know the reasons why kids are leaving programs? There's kind of the data that you collect. So if you're helping programs and you're going into programs, is everyone using the same tool to look for trends and gaps? And the third type of data is, are you getting the outcomes that you kind of want of the supports that you have? And those are kind of three different data questions and things that we could explore when we have more time. I think the last thought I would like to live with people is that, we're asking you to hold two scenarios in mind, right? And I think this audience is ready for those two scenarios. And the scenarios are, wow, like 70-80% of this work is really supporting program quality. And how do we use expulsion and suspension as a case for the kind of work you're doing with programs? And how can we use the expulsion work to bring more intention to the quality improvement? And then at the same time, we do have this population of kids who need something more, and the quality of their programs matter even more so. So I think keeping both sides of those coins balanced, I find in states have a preference of liking one side more than the other side, and I think we're asking state leaders to come together and hold both in their problem solving and in the approach that they're trying to develop.
Yeah.
And Nikki?
Yeah, I love that you used the word balance, because that was just kind of one of the things that was going through my mind, is that over the course of this past year, we've learned to be a little bit more balanced in the way that we talk about this issue in Arkansas. So I think in the beginning, we were a little heavy on the side of talking about the needs of the child and the need to keep a child in the classroom, that we don't want children pushed out of our classrooms. And really having to moderate that message a little bit with the reality of we don't want teachers pushed out either. And really recognizing the difficult position that sometimes our teachers or providers are in, and being sure that our systems are not lopsided, that we're hearing and seeing and understanding the needs of sort of everybody in these challenging scenarios. So it is that balance that was kind of echoing in my head.
Well, thank you. I'd like to close with reading a comment that someone put into the chat box, because I think it really speaks to the hope behind this big question and this topic. Children like Jessie attend our programs as well, and when working with early childhood providers, our message around the feelings of helplessness from the provider's part is that just by being that consistent, positive adult in this child's life is helping rebuild his brain to help him make sense of his world. While we may not know the exact right thing to do and say at any given moment, just providing a consistent, positive relationship with an adult is a critical intervention that will help this child be resilient over time. So I think that's a nice way to close out today. And I'd like to thank everyone for your contributions during the call, and especially to Nikki and Carrie for presenting such thoughtful information. And maybe we can con them into coming to the conference next year and presenting more about this topic. Thank you all so much. Goodbye.